The late afternoon sun stretched long golden rays across the dry valley, painting the red cliffs and scattered cottonwood trees in warm light. A small frontier town sat near the edge of the river, a place where travelers stopped to rest, trade, or disappear into the wide western wilderness. Dust hung lightly in the air from wagon wheels and horses that had passed through during the day. Inside the town's only saloon, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses filled the room. A piano played softly in the corner, while men in worn hats and dusty boots crowded around wooden tables. At one table near the window sat a young woman named Eliza Harper. She had arrived in town only 2 days earlier, traveling west with a supply wagon from a distant settlement. Her plan had been simple: stay for a few days, find work, and continue farther into the territory. But the town had already begun to show its rough edges. Eliza sat quietly with a cup of tea in her hands, watching the room with cautious eyes. Her brown hair was tied loosely behind her neck, and her pale green dress, though simple, stood out among the darker clothing of the men around her. She had learned quickly that being one of the only women in a frontier saloon attracted attention, most of it unwanted. Across the table from her sat a man named Carl Benton. He had been talking for nearly 10 minutes, leaning forward with a smile that made Eliza uncomfortable. "You must admit," Carl said, swirling his drink lazily, "a woman like you don't belong wandering these parts alone." Eliza forced a polite smile. "I manage just fine." Carl chuckled. "Maybe," he said, "but life would be a whole lot easier if you had someone watching out for you." She glanced toward the door, hoping for a distraction. Carl leaned a little closer. "I've got a ranch about 5 miles from here," he continued. "Plenty of room. You'd have a comfortable life." His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I'm not interested." Carl waved a dismissive hand. "You just haven't thought about it enough yet." Eliza tightened her grip on the cup. The room seemed to grow warmer, the air thicker. At that moment, the saloon doors swung open with a sharp creak. The sudden burst of evening light caused several men to glance toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside. He moved with quiet confidence, his presence instantly shifting the atmosphere of the room. He was an Apache warrior. His long dark hair was tied behind his shoulders, and his eyes moved calmly across the room as if measuring every person there. His clothing was simple but strong leather and woven fabric suited for riding long distances across harsh land. A few conversations in the saloon fell silent. It wasn't unusual for Apache traders or warriors to pass through the town, but something about this man carried a quiet authority that made people take notice. Eliza noticed him too. For a moment their eyes met across the crowded room. Then the warrior looked away and walked toward the bar. Carl didn't seem to notice. He leaned closer again. "Tell you what," he said with a grin, "why don't you let me buy you dinner tonight? We'll talk more about that ranch." Eliza shook her head. "I already told you no." Carl's smile faded slightly. "You're a stubborn one." "I prefer the word independent." Carl laughed, but there was an edge in it now. "You might want to rethink that attitude," he said quietly. "Life's tough out here." Before Eliza could reply, a shadow fell across their table. Carl looked up. The Apache warrior stood beside them. His expression was calm, but his presence filled the space like a storm gathering on the horizon. Carl frowned. "Can I help you?" The warrior didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved briefly to Eliza. Then he looked back at Carl. "She's taken by me tonight," he said calmly. The words were spoken without anger or force, yet they carried undeniable certainty. Carl blinked in surprise. "What?" The warrior stepped slightly closer to the table. "She will leave with me," he said. "You will not trouble her again." The room grew quieter as nearby men pretended not to listen. Carl scoffed. "You serious?" The warrior didn't respond. He simply stood there, steady and unshaken. Carl glanced around the room, realizing several people were watching now. He leaned back in his chair and chuckled awkwardly. "Well, if the lady wants to go with you, that's her business." He looked at Eliza. "What do you say?" Eliza's heart was racing. She had no idea who the warrior was or why he had stepped in, but she understood what he had just done. He had given her a way out. She stood slowly. "I'm leaving," she said. Carl lifted his hands with a smirk. "Suit yourself." Eliza walked toward the door. The warrior followed quietly behind her. Outside, the evening air felt cool and fresh after the smoky saloon. The sun was nearly gone, leaving soft purple shadows across the town. Eliza turned toward him. "Thank you," she said softly. The warrior studied her for a moment. "You looked uncomfortable." "I was," he nodded. "My name is Takoda," he said. "Eliza." They stood in silence for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I did." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Takoda glanced toward the distant hills. "Because no one else would." His words were simple, but they carried quiet truth. Eliza felt a small smile form. "Well," she said, "I'm grateful." Takoda gestured toward the road leading away from town. "Your wagon camp is outside the settlement." "Yes." "I will walk with you." They began walking together under the darkening sky. The sound of crickets and distant coyotes filled the quiet night. Eliza studied him as they walked. "You surprised everyone back there," she said. "That was the intention." She laughed softly. "You do that often." "No." They walked for a few minutes in silence. Then Takoda spoke again. "You travel alone, mostly. That is dangerous. I've noticed." He glanced at her. "Why do you travel?" Eliza thought about it. "I suppose I'm looking for a place where I belong." Takoda nodded slowly. "That is something many people search for." The moon rose above the hills as they reached the wagon camp. A small fire burned near the circle of wagons where a few travelers sat talking. Eliza stopped. "This is where I'm staying." Takoda nodded. She hesitated. "Will I see you again?" Takoda looked at her thoughtfully. "Yes," he said. Then he turned and began walking toward the open plains. Eliza watched until his figure disappeared into the silver moonlight. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again and again. Sometimes near the river, sometimes in town, sometimes along the quiet trails that wound through the valley. Each meeting felt less like coincidence and more like fate. Takoda showed her the hidden beauty of the land, the quiet springs in the hills, the places where wild horses grazed at sunrise, the ancient trails that stretched across the desert. Eliza shared stories of the towns she had seen and the dreams she carried with her. Slowly, a bond formed between them. One evening, nearly 2 months after that first meeting, they stood together on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sky blazed with the colors of sunset. Eliza looked out across the endless land. "You know," she said softly, "if you hadn't stepped into that saloon that night." Takoda glanced at her. "My life might have turned out very differently." He was quiet for a moment. "Mine as well." She turned toward him. "You changed everything." Takoda shook his head gently. "You chose your path." Eliza smiled. "Maybe." She looked back toward the glowing horizon. "But I'm glad you were standing there when I needed someone." Takoda stepped beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. And in that quiet moment beneath the vast western sky,